In this video, we'll show you how to replace the valve cover in your forward edge. This is located in the engine bay and right on top of the engine. Let's get started. To remove the engine cover, you can simply pop it up. It's good to do the front first and then the back. We can just set that off to the side. Using a 7mm or a flathead screwdriver, we can go ahead and loosen up the hose clamp at the beginning of the intake. Get that loose, start to wiggle it off. Moving inward on the intake, we can loosen up the second hose clamp. We can remove this stud using a 13mm. There's a small rubber hose connected to the intake. And just pull that off. Now we can take our intake tube, pop it off the inner portion. Pop the other end off of the box. And now we can kind of just fold this forward and out of the way. We can go ahead and pop the little clip holding the wiring harness off. Using an 8mm, we can go ahead and remove the bolt holding in the coil pack. On the front side of the coil pack, we have the electrical connector. There's a small red tab. We're going to push that towards the front of the vehicle. Then you can press down on the black portion of the tab in front of that. Pop the connector out. You always want to check your connectors for any damage or corrosion. Now you can go ahead and pull up on the coil pack. And there we have it. We can remove the bolt holding the back portion of our intake onto the valve cover using an 8mm. With the bolt removed, you can pop that off the grommet, and that'll give us enough room to remove the valve cover. It's the same procedure as that one to remove the rest of the coil packs. Now we need to start undoing some electrical connectors to get the wiring harness out of the way. At the front of the engine, we have our variable timing solenoids. And press in on the tab at the top of the sensor and pull the electrical connector out. You want to check for each one of these for any damage or corrosion. Working our way down the wiring harness, you'll also want to disconnect any points that connect the wiring harness to the valve cover. Can unplug both of our cam sensors. We have a vacuum line that crosses over the valve cover here. In order to release that, we have a blue tab. We need to spread each of these tabs up at the top. Push down, and that'll allow that one to release. Then we can go ahead and pinch the lower one. And get that one to release as well. On the front of the intake manifold, behind our heat shroud here. You can disconnect the electrical connector for one of the map sensors. We have a vacuum hose on the back side of the valve cover. We need to remove that as well. To do that, we can pinch on the tab, top and bottom. It's good to press in on the fitting while you do this, and then we can pull out. There are 2 plastic clips on the back side on top of a couple of the bits of hardware that we need to remove the valve cover. Simply pull up on those. That'll give us access to the bolts. Now we have 13 8mm to remove the valve cover. I'm going to go around and get all of these just started, and then I can remove them by hand. We can remove the dipstick and set that off to the side. Now you want to be very careful while removing the valve cover. You can use a small pry bar, but be cautious not to damage anything. We'll start to work out the front end of the engine first and working towards the back, and we can remove the valve cover. There's a handful of areas on this engine where they use silicone gasket maker. We're going to have to reapply that, but before we can, we need to clean the old stuff off. To do that, I'll be using a gasket scraper, as well as a flat razor blade, and a rag with some brake parts cleaner. First, I'm going to come in with the gasket scraper. You always want to scrape away from the inside of the engine, and try to pick up as much of the gasket maker as you can. For some bits along the edge, it's better to use a flat blade razor blade. Once you have the area sufficiently scraped up, and put some of that brake parts cleaner on a rag. We'll start to wipe up the area. You can work your way around the head until all of the old gasket maker is removed and the sealing surface is clean. Before we can get the valve cover in place, we have 6 spots that we need to put some silicone gasket maker. We have 2 up front on either side of the timing chain, and 4 in the rear on either side of both of the camshafts. You only need a small bead about 5 millimeters long. There's a small seam between the timing cover and the head up front. We'll put another small bead right there. Before we can install our valve cover, we need to swap over the cam angle sensors on the back of the valve cover here. We can remove them with an 8mm. And we can simply pull the cam sensor out and we'll swap that over. Make sure the O-ring fully sets in. We'll snug that down. And we can do the same with the other one. You want to be cautious of the wiring harness as you start to get the valve cover in. Once you have the valve cover on the head and lined up, you can start to thread in all of the hardware. It's good to get all the hardware started in before you tighten down any one piece of hardware. Now that I have all the bolts started in by hand, I'm going to go around and snug them down with just a socket, and then I will go back through following the procedure and torque them down. Following the procedure on screen, we can torque these to 7.38 foot-pounds. Before installing the coil packs, it's good to use some dielectric grease down at the bottom where it'll go onto the spark plug, as well as up at the top where it will sit on the valve cover. Slide the coil pack in, press down, and make sure it's set onto the spark plug. We'll get the stud in, and we can snug that down. We can do the same with the other 3 coil packs. We can get the 2 clips onto the studs at the back of the valve cover. Now we can start getting the wiring harness and some of our vacuum hoses back in place. You can plug in both of the cam angle sensors. When you plug in any connectors, make sure that they're fully seated and locked down. You can feed the map sensor connector back behind the insulation. We'll plug in each of the coil packs. Make sure those lock in. Press down on the red tab. Plug in both of your variable valve timing solenoids. Make sure you get each of the wiring harness clips back onto their studs. Get our vacuum lines back on. Make sure that's fully seated and not going to pull back off. Same with that one. Press up on the blue tab and make sure that's locked in. We can get our intake piping lined back up into its grommet. And we can just snug that one down. We can get our breather hose back on the back side of the valve cover. Make sure that locks down. Reinstall the oil level indicator. And go ahead and get our intake piece back under the vacuum line. Get it onto the intake box. Get the vacuum line on. We'll get the studs started in. We'll snug that down and tighten down each of the hose clamps. Line up the grommets and press down on the engine cover. Start the vehicle and make sure you don't have a check engine light. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.